So we're going to finish Genesis today. And Jerry said, well, what should he teach? And I said, well, we get them into Egypt. We should go a little further and talk about how we get them back out of Egypt. So I think he's going to do a little bit of an introduction to Exodus, kind of a continuance of the story. So what I want you to think of today, and if you have any comments or questions, please make them. We assume that Moses wrote the book of Genesis, though there's a lot of ideas that he had documents that the people who this is about, way back to the time of Abraham and before, were literate people and had writing, and the archaeologists find all kinds of libraries of these clay either cylinders or flat, where they make the marks in the clay and then it hardens. So there is the assumption that Moses had documents, that the detail that he has and the genealogies were from documents that he had access to. Now, how he had access to them would be interesting to speculate, since Moses had, I guess you could assume that maybe he that the Egyptians had some exchange of information, and they had these in their libraries. But anyway, my question more is not who wrote it, but why? Why the book of Genesis? So think about that. Why all of this is written? So the 50th chapter, the last chapter of Genesis, is interesting on several levels, and it has one golden text that we would definitely want to have in our hearts and minds before we close Genesis. So what I'm observing, and you probably are too if you're reading this through, is that Jacob, it still is the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and several times these three are quoted in the New Testament. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the patriarchs. And we talked about a lot and dwelled on the fact that Jacob was kind of slow getting his feet in under the ground and his head into this. But when he finally got it, and in his older years, he seems to really be the third patriarch. He seems to be the last of the patriarchs. And he has this sense of of God's promise to create a nation out of them and to give them the land that they have been just living in as sort of guests for these three generations. So you see, as you get to the end of Genesis, that Jacob is very reluctant to leave and go into Egypt in the first place. God himself has to assure him that he will bring he and his people back, and he will still give them this land. But then Jacob becomes kind of a celebrity. Joseph, has been the man in Egypt for these years of the famine. He is the man that everybody goes to for their grain and things. So when his family comes, they're all welcomed as really important people. But Jacob, his father, is presented to Pharaoh, and he becomes, the Egyptians seem to get the idea that this old man is a patriarch of significance, that he is the beginner of something significant. So he's kind of a celebrity. Then last session we looked through his blessing in his very last days, blessing of his sons, and sort of prophetically talking about what they would become. And though I admitted that I don't have a detailed study of all the allusions in this chapter, and I don't really know anybody who does, though I think mentioned that J. Vernon McGee said that he had a companion that was in college with him who wrote his PhD thesis on this chapter, tracing down all these, the significance of these prophecies. But other than that, they don't really mean that much to us, except for the overall significance that by blessing each of his sons, Jacob is prophetically saying, you boys are going to raise families, and your families are going to have families, and this is going to grow into a nation that God is going to give the land to, and you're all going to be involved in it. When the people get into the land, you still are going to be the heads of the clans that make up the nation of Israel. So then it's very dramatic that it says that after he had blessed his sons, he got back into bed, pulled his knees up, and died. Now, whether it was within just a few hours but anyway, the way the story tells it, you'd think he said the last word to the last son, and then in a few minutes was dead. If that's the case, it's kind of something that God has a hand in. So we start chapter 50 with Joseph grieving, and these people seem to know how to grieve. I mean, now we have traditions that go back of people who had a certain amount of grieving that was expected, and in Jesus' day they had professional grievers that came in and wept and made loud noises and stuff, and had a kind of a professional funeral group. But back here, they had a certain amount of time that you were to grieve. Now that didn't mean that life stopped completely, but that the grieving was always there. So it's interesting that Jacob is embalmed. In other words, they make a mummy out of him. Now, this, I don't know that you ever paid any attention to this, but the Egyptians had somewhat mysterious ways of preserving the bodies with this mummy making. And it involved taking out the internal parts so they didn't rot and so forth. But it took them 40 days to do that. And they soaked the body in various things and so forth. So Joseph turns his father's body over to, it says, his physicians. He's important enough to have his own group of physicians that are answerable to him. And he has them embalm his father. But Jacob makes it very clear that he doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. Now, the rest of them are all going to be buried in Egypt except Joseph. So we don't want to get the idea that the scripture is teaching us that where you're buried is so deeply significant. But for Jacob it was. Because as the last of the patriarchs, he wanted it to be symbolic that he was taken back and buried in the promised land. J. Vernon McGee believes that the patriarchs were very strongly believing in resurrection of the body. And so Jacob wanted to be in the right place when he was resurrected. I hate to question J. Vernon McGee, but I don't see anything in Genesis that talks about that. In fact, it's interesting that in Jesus' day, this was a dividing issue. The Sadducees, who were the priests, the highest religious class in Israel, so supposedly, did not believe there was any resurrection, nor did they believe there were angels. Now, they felt that only these first 5 books were to be accepted. They didn't worry about references in the prophets and the Psalms and so forth. But even then, even reading the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. Penta means 5, so these 5 books. Still, you see, I love their expression. You can kind of take it however, that he breathed his last and was gathered to his people. This is this Genesis phrase. He was gathered to his people. Now you could take that to mean simply he was buried in the family plot, which in Jacob's case he was, but this is separated from the time when they actually bury him. So I'm thinking there is kind of a hint here of an afterlife. And of course, the Pharisees and the common people in Jesus' day believed strongly in an afterlife. But I don't know how clearly they had the idea of a physical resurrection. Liz and I came upon some books written by an Israeli, a Jewish person, in which he gets so carried away with this resurrection idea. They suddenly begin finding people in the cemetery wandering around who have been dead for 100 years. And suddenly there's the population of Israel almost doubles because all these people are coming out of the tombs. And I'm saying, really? So anyway, this was a work of fiction. I don't know that this person was saying this is theology. But anyway, Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. This is a very emotional thing for Joseph because of the years of separation, because he hadn't seen his father since he and his father were so close when he was a little boy. So it's hard for him to now part from his father at his death. So he is, and you see that back with the time of Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, he's a very emotional person. This is all very emotional for him. He has to excuse himself and go off to his chambers and cry and then wash his face and come back so he can keep up the pretense that they don't know that he's their brother. So anyway, then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now, I don't know what they did to mourn for 70 days. You know, we have the older customs of people dressing in black to show they were in mourning. They had some custom of mourning, and they would, I suppose, when a pharaoh died, have 70 days of mourning. But you see how important Jacob becomes to them, how much they see him as a historic figure, an important personage. So the Egyptian people, at least the closer ones around Joseph, mourned for 70 days. Then when the days of mourning had passed, Joseph then goes to Pharaoh. So it's been 40 days of embalming and 30 more days of mourning. And then Joseph goes to Pharaoh because he still has Pharaoh above him. He must get permission for things. And he says, you know, my father made me swear an oath. This is a very significant thing. And you remember that his father did make him swear an oath that he would not be buried in Egypt, but would be taken back to the family tomb. I don't know what to make of the phrase that Jacob says that I dug for myself. Maybe he enlarged the tomb during his days because it was a cave and nothing is said about them digging anything in the earlier stories. But Joseph quotes Jacob as saying, bury me in the tomb that I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Bury me with my father and my fathers, the other patriarchs. So Joseph says, so I want permission to take my father and bury him in Canaan, and then I will come back. He knows that the Pharaoh, I presume all this is still in those last days of the famine. So he knows that the Pharaoh expects him to come back and finish his service. The Pharaoh says, go up and bury your father, as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and all of Pharaoh's officials went with him. We have this tremendous funeral, and when they arrive there, they find somebody's flat land where he did his threshing and stuff, where it's big enough for them to stay. Thank you. And they have 7 active days of mourning there, and the people around are observing all this. This is the Egyptians with all of their pomp coming here into our land for this funeral. So they buried him then in the same cave where the other patriarchs were buried, Abraham and Isaac, and the wives, Sarah and Leah, were buried there. And Rebecca, not Rachel. Rachel didn't make it back. So anyway, with their chariots and their horsemen, they went up, a very large company. And then you see in verse 10 that they reached this threshing floor. The great farms had this area where they gathered the shucks. They cut the grain in the field and bundled it, carried it in, and then they had to thrash it either with thrashing clubs, or sometimes they had a tethered oxen that would go around and walk over it and loosen the grain from the stalks. So they had this threshing floor, and they borrowed it to camp on and have this extra 7 days of mourning. Then they went on to bury him. The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning, the people around observing this said. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah. This is that same cave near Mamre, which Abraham had bought as a burial place from Ephraim the Hittite. And the field is along with the cave. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers. Now, they said that the mothers and little children didn't go up, and they didn't take their flocks and herds, but all of the adults of the family, all of the boys, the men especially, went up for this burial. So now they come back, and this is the interesting part of this chapter. And the brothers begin to say to each other, "Oh, you know, Joseph wouldn't do anything to us while Father was alive, but now that Father is dead, Joseph he's in a position to pay us back for what we did to him." And so they were very worried, and so they did. A little of Jacob is still here in his sons, you can see. So they went to Joseph and they said, "Before Father died, he told us to tell you that you were to be kind to us and not do anything to us. Father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph." I strongly doubt that this actually occurred, but it made a good way for them to plead their case. "I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly." What I do like about that is that the brothers are willing to come right out and admit that they treated their brother badly. They sinned against him. "Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of God." That's interesting. They're saying, remember, we're God's servants. God is wanting us preserved. So anything you do against us, God will be unhappy with. "The God of your father." Now, they send this message to Joseph, and Joseph reads their message and weeps. He's so sorry that his brothers still feel this way, that they don't understand. So then Joseph gathers the brothers. The brothers say to Joseph, "We're your slaves. Don't kill us. We'll work for you the rest of our lives. We'll be your slaves. Now, verse 19, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intend to harm me, but God, he said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done in the saving of many lives. So that, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. I love Jacob's statement, and it's one you can apply in your own situations. He says to the brothers, yeah, you did this out of anger. You meant harm to me. But God allowed it to happen. God was involved in it because he intended it for good. You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And see how well it came out. Do we see experiences in our own lives sometimes that somebody does something or something goes really wrong, and while we're saying, why does God let this happen? If you look back on it years later, you say, oh, I'm so glad God let that happen, because look what finally came of it. So, now Joseph then stays in Egypt, and his family stays in Egypt. Originally it was while there's only the famine. But the famine gets over, and they're well established, and they're happy where they are, and it's good. So they stay in Egypt, and they will stay in Egypt, several texts say, for 400 years. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years. My footnote tells me that 110 years was considered in Egypt to be the right old age. So even they still are living longer lives than you can see down further into history. So Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and the children also of Machir, son of Manasseh. So Joseph became a grandfather and a great-grandfather and maybe a great-great-grandfather before he died. And he continued to be the carer of the family. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. Now apparently, even though most of his brothers are older slightly than he is, Joseph is going to die at 110, and they're still around. So he says to them, God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's your three patriarchs. And Joseph made the sons of Israel, now probably more than just his brothers, but the leading men of each family. He made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Now, not in a pyramid, not in a deep someplace, but they in the Egyptian style that we are familiar with from archaeology, they placed him in an elaborate sarcophagus kind of thing, and he stayed there for those 400 years, or what was left of him. And then when they left, and you read on in Joshua, they actually took Joseph's body with them, at least the mummy, carried it all through those 40 years in the wilderness. How'd they do that? I don't know, but they did. Took it into the land, and when they finally had subdued the land and were at peace enough, they buried it. Not in, apparently, from what I read, not in the tomb with the patriarchs, but in a separate tomb, closer more to the place where they sold Joseph into slavery. I don't know if there's any significance to that. But there's references to the fact that Jacob had purchased, or at one point I pointed out to you, he says that he took this land from the Hittites with his sword and his bow, and I know nothing in the story about him doing that. But anyway, he had a portion of land, and I'm wondering if this connects to the well and the tradition of the well that we see in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. That This was Jacob's well. The book of Genesis never talks about Jacob digging a well or there being a well of Jacob, but there it is in the customs of the Samaritan people that this well, this very deep well, was Jacob's well, and it was in this, and somehow Joseph is buried in a tomb that they must construct for him there in the central part. And the interesting thing is that where are they going to bury Joseph? They're going to bury him in that cave that's part of Judah? No, they're going to bury him in a cave that's part of Ephraim, because Ephraim is his person. Ephraim is carrying on the line of Joseph. So that's the end of the book. It's kind of said, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I heard it several times, that Genesis begins in a garden in Eden and ends in a coffin in Egypt. Well, that doesn't really tell you much about the book or the purpose of the book, but it's factual. It does start with a garden in Eden where God begins and all. And I still have this question of, if Moses writes this or whoever writes it, why do they write it? Why is it this way, that it begins at the garden and ends with them going into Egypt? Any ideas why that would be? If Moses wrote it, why would Moses go to it would have been a lot of effort, a lot of time and scholarship and help for him to gather this information and write all this. Of course, Moses, if we understand, is a prolific writer. We assume Moses wrote Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a book in which Moses, the aged Moses, speaks to the people before they go into the promised land and re-gives them the law. There was a question on Jeopardy about what book has a 2 as part of its name, and yet it's not a second book. Well, it's Deuteronomy. Deuto is 2. And so it's the second giving of the law. And if you read it, you see that Moses goes over the 10 Commandments. One interesting thing, significant thing, is that in Exodus, when he talks about the Sabbath law, he says God created the world in 7 days, and 6 days, and rested on the 7th. Therefore, we should rest on the 7th day. But in Deuteronomy, he says you were slaves in Egypt. Slaves don't get a day of rest. And now God has set you free, so you should rest on the 7th day because you were slaves who have been set free. I thought that was interesting and significant, that the Sabbath then became a kind of a sign of the freedom that God had given them. But anyway, Moses writes all these books. And if he writes those 4, it's not too much to suppose that he had the ability to write Genesis. But why? Well, I suppose because we see Moses growing up in Egypt and discovering that he really is a Hebrew, though he's raised as a foster son of the Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace, raised as a prince of Egypt. Jerry says he could just bring his material here and show you the film The Prince of Egypt, and you'd have all of that explained to you. But anyway, what does Moses know about the lives of the patriarchs and the land that they're going to go to? Well, you can see why Moses would want to know, and then he would want his people to know, and God would want us to know. So I think the reason why Jacob writes the book of Genesis and writes it as he does is so that we have a clear understanding that this isn't something that this people kind of made up. They were slaves in Egypt. And they made this up that they were a special people to sort of get them motivated to leave and all go through the wilderness. But no, that Moses wanted people to see that God, after the creation and after the flood and after the building of the tower, and the kind of God saying, oh, these people, they just keep turning away from me and forgetting me. That God chose Abraham and promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, of great people, of kings. And then God followed through Isaac, and then through Jacob, and then brought them into Egypt, where Joseph is so significant. And this is all the background of who they were, how they got there, why Moses could go to Pharaoh and say, God says, let my people go, why they were his people, why Moses had this experience at the burning bush of God saying, I feel for my people, and so I want you to go and set them free. Okay, we have some time. Is there anything you want to talk about from Genesis? Any questions? Anything that struck you as interesting that we might want to say more about? If you know me, you know that I've always got more to say about anything and everything. My kids used to say, don't ask Dad, you don't want to know that much.
Or we used to say, ask Dad right at bedtime, because then you'll get to stay up.
Yeah, we had this interesting time that when
devious children you are.
Yeah. I remember my oldest son coming when we were in bed ready to go to sleep and wanting to talk about, he was wanting to get engaged and he wanted our opinion about it. So here we are in bed ready to go to sleep, and he comes in, sits on the bed and talks to us. So anyway, what do you want to talk about with the 15 minutes or so we have left? Anything of this story all the way back and how come this is significant to us? I think when we were starting it, I talked about why it's significant to us, because you can't read the New Testament and not realize that the ministry of Jesus coming into the world, is all based on the Old Testament. So much of what Jesus does is fulfillment of things from the Old Testament. Not only actual prophecies in word of what he did, but allusions from the Old Testament. Matthew has this kind of strange statement that Matthew tells us that because Jesus was threatened by King Herod as a baby, King Herod wanted to find him and kill him so that he couldn't become king of the Jews. And so Joseph receives a warning from an angel in a dream to take take Jesus and Mary and go into Egypt. So he does. And he stays there until an angel comes and tells him, now it's time to go home because there's no danger to Jesus. And when that happens, Matthew quotes one of the prophets saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, obviously, when the prophet said this, and when the Jewish people read it for hundreds of years, they said, yeah, God said, out of Egypt I called my son. My son is Israel. My son is the nation. But Matthew says, no, this is a way that sort of alludes to the fact that Jesus would be the Son of God and would be called back out of Egypt to take his place as the Son of God. So we have these kind of illusion things. Job mentioning, I know that my Redeemer lives, becomes an understanding of the role of Jesus and what he accomplishes for us. The book of Ruth is all really would have no great purpose except to show us how David comes into the world, but David's, in spite of all that he did as a successful king, his main meaning to the New Testament people is that through his line comes the great king, the Messiah. So all of this Old Testament background is significant, and Jesus uses the phrase of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, time is coming when people from all over will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the great celebration of the eternity. So, okay, or do you have some interesting things about this relationship to Egypt, that the patriarch, the last patriarch, is mummified in the Egyptian custom? Of course, the Egyptians had, maybe J. Vernon McGee's got a point, because the Egyptians had an idea about resurrection of the dead, especially of their pharaohs, and that's why they buried them as they did, with things they would need when they returned from the dead. So maybe the patriarchs did have a stronger sense of personal resurrection, that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob would actually see this land as their land. Now, J. Vernon McGee is a prophecy buff person, and so he has this all figured out, and he may be right, that Jesus returns and becomes for 1,000 years the king of the world, reigning on the throne of David from Jerusalem, and so the patriarchs can come back in that 1,000 years and see the final full fulfillment of God's promise, that now one of his children, Paul says, when he says the seed of Abraham, he doesn't mean seeds, lots of them. He means one seed, the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of God, who is the seed of Abraham. So anyway, this relationship with Egypt, you can see how culture was developing in the ancient days, and how by being in Egypt, even though it was burdensome and it was sad for the Jews to be slaves in Egypt, they learned a lot from the Egyptians, and I'm sure that a lot of the culture that developed when they were a nation goes back to things that they learned and things they put in place from their time in Egypt. Then, of course, later, their time in Babylon, they had a way of learning more of the culture of the Mesopotamian area. So, but these last chapters of Genesis, you can see if Moses indeed is writing this for that purpose, that he wants us to see very clearly how God worked through Jacob and his 12 sons to begin this nation, and how he brought them into Egypt. So when Jacob says God meant it for good, at the time he says that, he just means you were rescued from the famine, from starving to death. You were brought here to develop in a protected place. God meant that for good. But perhaps he has this prophetic sense to realize that the good includes that they will become a nation in Egypt, and God will take them out of Egypt as a nation and put them in the land now as a nation that can control the land, that can really be the inhabitants of the promised land. Okay, I keep talking, and I miss Ed Knopfsinger. He would have
You'd have
questions.
something to say,
Yeah.
that's why, yeah.
And in my Wednesday group, I have Dave. Most of you don't have a chance to know Dave. A few of you maybe have met him, but he always has questions. If I say, you have a question, oh, Dave always has questions. And some of them I can answer, some of them I answer, and people are saying, where did you get all that? Well, I got it out of 70 years of study, or at least 60. But then he asks questions that I don't have answers to, and I'm puzzling over one of those right now. We reached the first verse of the 12th chapter of Romans, where God says, present your body a living sacrifice, through Paul's writings. And Dave says, so what did Jesus say about the practice of sacrifice? So I'm searching through to see what all did Jesus say about the practice of sacrifice. I've got a few verses to share with him, but I probably will hunt for more between now and Wednesday.
Sounds like that could be a new Sunday school study.
Okay.
There's an interesting parallel that strikes me between this last phrase that Joseph uses, that you intended this for harm, but God intended it for good. It does sort of resonate with someone else later in the Bible, where he is treated in a way that his enemies intend for harm, but God intends to use for good to save many people.
Absolutely.
So there's definitely an echo there.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. There's a lot about Joseph's life and the experience of Israel as a people that you can see is shadowing forward to a higher use of this idea in the life of Christ, and that certainly is one, Jared. That's a very good observation. And even others in the New Testament. What I am going to be talking about in my sermon is Paul's last days, waiting to be executed, and he doesn't seem to be feeling like, well, God, after all I've done for you, why in the world are you letting me be executed? He seems rather to feel that his execution is something that God means for good, that the fact that he was willing to die for what he taught was the ultimate assurance that what he taught was real to him. It wasn't just something he'd made up for it to be a good idea to build on. Okay. So I'm not sure why the Hebrews stayed in Egypt. Did they have some revelation from God? Did Joseph have some understanding that they really were supposed to stay? It seems that they would have, when Joseph died, that they would have gotten together and said, not only do we need to take Joseph back, we need to go back. But they didn't seem to do that. They seemed to be content to stay in Egypt. And at that point in time, Egypt was a very good place for them. I'm sure it was a lot easier to live in Egypt than it had been to try to live among peoples that they had no real tie with and try to make it on their own, as it were. To find pasture for their growing flocks and herds. But in Egypt, in Goshen, there was lots of pasture. So they were happy there. What do you make of Jacob's sons, Joseph's brothers, having this idea that Joseph has been kind to us, but it was only because of Father. Now that Father has died, he's going to turn cruel, and he's going to get even with us for what we did to him. They didn't seem to be able to believe in Joseph saying that he loved them, that he really welcomed them into his life and into his world. And they seem still to have dark, bitter kind of attitudes. we observed earlier that they're really not all that special of people, and yet God treats them specially and does a special work through them, even though they've got their flaws and faults.
They were half brothers, weren't they? Half brothers.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Half brothers.
They were half brothers.
yeah.
Oh,
They didn't
half
have the
brothers.
same
We weren't,
mother.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Except for Benjamin, yeah,
Except Benjamin was his only full brother,
yeah.
and when he greets them, he gives Benjamin more attention, but then nothing more is said about this. When Jacob gives his prophecies, he doesn't say anything really glowing about Benjamin. It's pretty much the same as the others.
I guess it shows all the way this far back that the concept of grace is just hard to get your brain wrapped around.
Yeah,
It is,
It
it
really
is.
is. If
The-
you
the-
don't have any experience with God, you can't
Yeah,
get it.
Joseph's response to them is the very
Right.
picture of grace. They did
Yeah.
nothing to earn his forgiveness,
Mhm.
no,
but they showed up and they had it anyway, and they never could quite believe it.
yeah,
You know, he can't possibly have really forgiven us for what we've done,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah, there's a good strong lesson there that I think in Christianity there are a lot of people who go through the motions and theoretically believe that they have a relationship with God and they've been forgiven, but they can't really grasp it. When they're all by themselves, they feel like, well, surely God can't have forgiven me for some of the things that I did. And yet ones like the Apostle Paul live their life on that grace. I mean, he freely says, I shouldn't be saved. I'm the worst. I'm the least. And yet God saved me to show that he can save anybody. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up Genesis there then. And Jerry will take you then 400 years into the future, and we'll deal with what happens then to them in Egypt and what sets the scene. And you can see that from Moses' point of view and from the point of view of the Jewish people afterwards, the great thing was the Exodus. The great thing was Moses. The great thing was the giving of the law. And so the idea that Moses wanted to have them see that God was there doing all this long before that the Exodus was the natural conclusion of what God had been doing all through Genesis, and not something distinctly of its own. So the life of Moses and the experience of Moses and the Egyptians becomes very significant, but its significance is simply a continuation. The idea that the Bible is one story from beginning to end, and it's not surprising or coincidental that some of the things you see as symbolic significance in those early chapters of Genesis, you see again in the closing chapters of Revelation. You see a river and trees, and you see things that are kind of a garden setting that kind of seems like, well, God had a garden, they were put out of the garden and the garden went away, and now in the book of Revelation the garden comes back and they come back, the humankind comes back to inhabit the garden with God again. So it's one story. And in spite of the fact that these 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, seems to be the real core of the Old Testament, actually the book of Joshua sort of completes it, that God says to Abraham, I'm going to make a nation of you and I'm going to give you this land. And in the book of Joshua, they are a nation and they're given the land. Now, then the story just seems to start over again, because they almost, relive the kind of rejection of God that starts with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And the book of Judges is a terrible book of the disloyalty of the people. And then we start again, and we come to through 1 Samuel and through Ruth, that is the background of David. We come to David becoming the central figure. We have Moses, and then David becomes the central figure. And then it goes through the kings and the captivity and the return to the land. And the whole story keeps going until finally it comes to the fruition of, we begin to see that what God was always promising was something bigger, more, the sending of his own son, the coming himself into his world to be with us and to change everything. So Genesis is a very interesting beginning to all of that. Okay, any last thoughts? All right, I will leave it with you then, and when I come back, we'll see if we need to kind of wrap this up a little more with their Egypt and Exodus experience. And then I want to go back to the New Testament. I want to go to the Gospel of Luke. And we'll start with the ministry of Jesus, kind of where Mark starts his gospel, and where actually all four Gospels come together with the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the ministry of John the Baptist and the introduction of Jesus. We'll begin there in Luke. And then when it comes December, we'll go back and we'll look at the unique story that Luke gives us of how Jesus came into the world, the Christmas story as we know it. And we'll find some new things to talk about in that wonderful story. But then we'll continue on through the book of Luke, and as we move forward to Easter time, to the celebration of the crucifixion and resurrection, we'll let Luke prepare our hearts for that. I think we'll enjoy our study of Luke together. Okay, let us close with a word of prayer. Father, again, we just thank you for your word. We thank you for making it available to us so that every one of us can have it for ourselves and read it, and let you speak to us personally. Let you be our personal God, and then together bond and band together around this word and its promises and the life that it creates in us. And so we thank you for that, and we thank you for our opportunity to gather together and study your word and look more deeply into what it teaches us. Help us, send your Spirit always to our aid in understanding your word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.